So I'll just introduce Dr. Kokoli and then also remind you that we'll keep questions for after the talk. So please write down your questions and we'll, give you the ability to put your mic on and ask your question out loud. So Dr. Alexandra Kokoli researches feminist, artistic, and activist practices. She works as associate professor in visual culture at Middlesex University and is senior research associate at the University of Johannesburg. She has published widely, including the edited collections Feminism Refrained, Susan Hiller, The Provisional Texture of Reality, Art into Life, Essays on Tracy Amin, and the monograph The Feminist Uncanny in Theory and Art Practice. She co-leads the Transnational Early Career Research Network in Visual and Performing Arts funded by the British Academy. Her research on the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common has been supported by the Paul Mellon Center and the Leverhulme Trust. So I'll just pass it along to you, Dr.
Thank you so much, Donna, for this invitation and for hosting me today, and to all of you for turning up and for your engagement so far if you've been to the seminars as well. I will copy Freud by starting with disclaimers and excuses. Perhaps they're excuses rather than disclaimers. So the way I see it, the uncanny is more ordinary and at the same time more pervasive than horror or the Gothic. It is an irritant, first and foremost, an embarrassing reminder of our blind spots and failures, a trespasser and a spoilsport. So apologies in advance if you expected abject leaking bodies today and Halloweeny fright fests. It will be much more sedate than that, but still painfully uncomfortable, so rest assured. And a second caveat, my long-standing engagement with psychoanalysis and Freud's writing in particular is not inspired by fandom or let alone endorsement, but a productive antagonism. Feminism and psychoanalysis make unlikely bedfellows, and even though feminism found in the uncanny a strategic vehicle for angry defamiliarization, the two of them are never quite at home with one another. So while the feminist uncanny marks a range of strategies and tactics of cultural subversion, or more precisely, for what I call the aesthetic mobilization of discomfort to political ends, the feminist uncanny is also a cipher of an unhappy partnership, compromising, and rooted in profound ambivalence. In the uncanny, which Freud described as the disturbing fallout of the return of the repressed, feminism discovered an unexpected ally in its attempt to forge subversive countercultural strategies, to claim a place in the canons of creative practice and critical theory, and to revolutionize them in doing so. Such strategies involve a process of defamiliarization, namely of uncovering the strangeness of what is assumed to be known, established or ordinary. But unlike, say, the Russian formalist Ostraneni defamiliarization, namely, the defamiliarization of the feminist uncanny is tinged with an indictment of the division between the familiar and the unfamiliar in the first place, a division imbued in the politics of power. In the context of the discipline of art history specifically, divisions between the known, also assumed to be worth knowing, and the unknown, assumed to be minor, marginal, of lesser importance, or less representative of movements or traditions, are both the reflection and the vehicle of the authoritative value judgments. Insidiously, such divisions filter down to the mainstream, lay understandings of art history and value, and become entrenched, validated, and naturalized through repetition. Hence, among the earlier tasks of feminist art history has been the interrogation of the criteria operating within and through the discipline. Linda Nocklin's, for example, her early question, why have there not been great women artists, has been met, of course, with a multitude of answers, ranging from the rediscovery of forgotten, marginalized, or underrated women artists and traditions of female collective and sometimes anonymous cultural production, to the systemic unmaking of the implicitly gendered classed, and racialized construct of the solitary artistic genius. Either way, ignorance was stripped of its claim to innocence. In the exhibition catalog of the ICA exhibition About Time that you can see a well-worn copy of it on the screen. Lynn McRitchie simultaneously underlines the timeliness of this women-only group show and acknowledges that it is, quote, a mere drop from the pool available. Thus, the unfamiliarity of work by women artists does not lie in its rarity, it lies in its suppression. If the strange bears the mark of its suppression, then contaminating the familiar with unsettling unfamiliarity can be a righteous turning of the tables, a justified act of overdue retribution. The Feminist Uncanny exposes the presumed familiarity of the field of culture as a fraud, and worse, as a crime of symbolic violence. In the uncanny, the return of the repressed is not horrifying due to what has been repressed, but due to the unearthing of the event of repression in itself. For feminism, the feminine that returns is not monstrous or grotesque in itself, although both monstrousness and grotesqueness have been used as vehicles for exploring the effects of its repression. The return of the feminine bears the mark of its imposed exile from which it broke free. Its scars are what is uncanny, and its return against the odds is terrible by design. The feminist uncanny is perpetually suspended between revision and revenge. I have often had to explain and justify my focus on psychoanalysis as a feminist, even though, as I said at the beginning, it's not exactly based on fandom. To view feminism and psychoanalysis as mutually incompatible, however, only stems from willful ignorance of the history of the feminist 1970s in theory and in art practice. Laura Mulvey, famously, suggests that feminists discovered a certain beauty, quote unquote, in Freudian and Lacanian accounts of castration and the feminine sexuality, thanks to their, quote, thanks to their, quote, exact rendering of the frustration experienced under the phallocentric order. Psychoanalytic theory, Mulvey continues, gets us near to the roots of our oppression. It brings closer an articulation of the problem. It faces us with the ultimate challenge: how to fight the unconscious structured like a language, formed critically at the moment of the arrival of language, while still caught within the language of patriarchy. In her introduction to the 2009 edition of Visual and Other Pleasures, that is the collection in which famously Mulvey herself curates her famous essay, A Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, among her other writings. Mulvey reminds us in that new introduction, again, that it is as a filmmaker and within her practice that she fought against patriarchy, mobilizing psychoanalysis within her artistic arsenal. This appropriation of psychoanalysis by feminism, also advocated by Juliet Mitchell in her 1974 formative book, Psychoanalysis and Feminism, is only one of second-wave feminism's contributions to a long-standing relationship that has often been too close for comfort. Shulamith Firestone brands psychoanalysis as, quote, the misguided feminism, making note of their considerable common ground. Both, she says, quote, came as reactions to one of the smuggest periods in Western civilization, the Victorian era. But Freud was merely a diagnostician for what feminism purports to cure. Eventually, Firestone concludes, Freudianism subsumed the place of feminism as the lesser of two evils. But both feminism and psychoanalysis responded to, quote, centuries of increasing privatization of family life, the resulting intensification of the oppression of women, and the concomitant ill effects of sexual repression. Yet, whereas Freud, question the given reality, subsequent incarnations of psychoanalysis as a therapeutic method, Firestone argues, were weaponized against feminism in the 60s and thereafter. And this is exactly why their links have been disavowed subsequently. While strategically useful and even seductively eloquent in regard to women's oppression, as Mulvey suggests, Freudian psychoanalysis colluded in the end in this very oppression, as Firestone argues. The notion that there is an intimate, perhaps even fated, historical link between the two, meaning psychoanalysis and feminism, has haunted one substantial section of feminist thought in the last 20 years, they say in the early 90s, so early 70s to early 90s, even when the specific content not only of Freud's theories of femininity, but of many other aspects of psychoanalytic theory have been censured. We were made for each other, says one partner in the flash of rapture, only to be followed at a later, more bitter stage by a transformed insistence that the relationship was doomed from the start. Neither side ever lets go. Psychoanalysis and feminism seem to be locked into combat or copulation unto the death, according to Apignanesi and Forrester. So, if ignorance loses its innocence in psychoanalytically informed feminist art history, as I mentioned earlier, Apignanesi and Forrester demonstrate in their writing that there is no such thing as an innocent metaphor either. The marriage metaphor deployed here, obvious enough on the surface, becomes a sinister rabbit hole that reveals its violent underpinnings here in a suggestion of intimate partner violence. To the false choice between endless combat or fatal copulation, the most radical feminist response would be, of course, withdrawal, to walk away. Although the insights of psychoanalysis may well speak to all mankind, they have little relevance to anyone else. In the essay, Fears, Fantasies, and the Male Unconscious, or You Don't Know What's Happening, Do You, Mr. Jones, citing, of course, Bob Dylan, The Ballad of the Thin Man. So anyway, this essay, which was first published in Spare Rib, a feminist magazine in 1973, and which was on the Women as Furniture sculpture series by Alan Jones. Laura Mulvey, again, deals a blow to patriarchal structures of spectatorship, not by challenging their aesthetic or political legitimacy, which I think would be too obvious, but by confidently pointing out the enormity of the blind spots of their visual sexual economy. Mulvey's critique of the deployment of woman as spectacle reveals it as a defensive strategy, a phallic substitute for the male narcissistic fear of castration. Although symbolically already castrated, woman's objectified body beautiful comes to stand for the phallus as signifier. In Mulvey's careful reinterpretation of Alan Jones's work, in Mulvey's careful interpretation, Alan Jones's work becomes the bridge between the layperson's understanding of sexual fetishism and the feminist theoretical recasting of it as an exploitative mass media strategy in the ideological service of women's oppression. In retrospect, this political use of psychoanalysis and the resonance of fetishism in countercultural discourse were equally, of course, inspired by Marxist ideas around commodity fetishism, at once following and contributing to the almost alchemical fusion of Marx and Freud in the cultural politics of the New Left. And it is Mulvey who speaks of an alchemy between Marx and Freud repeatedly. While female objectification via phallocentric fetishism is no doubt undermining to women, its power over them is significantly limited. And I'm just going to read out this quote with you. Women are constantly confronted with their own image in one form or another, but what they see bears little relation or relevance to their own unconscious fantasies, their own hidden fears and desires. They are being turned all the time into objects of display, to be looked at and gazed at and stared at by men. Yet, in a real sense, women are not there at all. The parade has nothing to do with woman, everything to do with man. The true exhibit is the phallus. Women are simply the scenery onto which men project their narcissistic fantasies. So you may have noticed that I'm just over halfway through, and I have not yet talked about the flawed text that brought us here today. And now I seem to be suggesting walking away from psychoanalysis altogether. And my excuse is again that I'm not alone in this evasiveness. In fact, this is where I got some of my key ideas. In her introduction to this brilliant book, The Female Thermometer, 18th Century Culture and the Invention of the Uncanny, Terry Castle draws the reader's attention to an absent text, which nevertheless haunts her book throughout. The text is, unsurprisingly, Freud's essay, The Uncanny, magnificent, troubling, and inspired, as Castle calls it, which she values for its fundamental paradox of attempting to shed light on a persistently dark corner of the Enlightenment project, and which she proceeds to mine as a thematic index. What the uncanny demonstrates so powerfully is the powerlessness of reason in the face of both individual and cultural unconscious. While most of the attackers of the Enlightenment focus on the authoritarian and oppressive compensations of the repressed powerlessness of reason, Freud both addresses and performs this powerlessness, as he so often does. Firstly, through the choice of the uncanny, an archaic fantasy of fear, long ago exiled to the unconscious, that nonetheless returns to view. And secondly, and most importantly, by demonstrating in his own practice the inadequacies of reason, including his own reasoning. Castle finds in Freud's essay a template for her own scholarly work, which is framed by the knowledge that the more we seek enlightenment, the more alienating our world becomes. Although she doesn't quite spell out the instructive capacity of the flaws and contradictions in Freud's essay, she makes the important point that the object of the Enlightenment's faltering pursuit of knowledge is often gendered and or even cast as femininity itself. Alongside developing technologies of surveillance and spectacle, Castle relates the uncanny to major 18th century preoccupations, including masquerade, sexual impersonation, and a resulting blurring of fixed categories in gender and sexuality. For Castle, the emergence of the uncanny is therefore presented as a side effect of the Enlightenment and its will to knowledge, both intellectual and technological, and is also tied to growing anxieties around threats to established economies of gender and sexuality. Oops, apologies. The uncanny haunts my endeavors too, and yet, like Castle, I hesitate summarizing the essay here for a number of reasons, including the fact that you've probably spent just over a week discussing it. But first and most obviously, yes, it is unlikely that any of you have not read it. And if you haven't yet, this lecture will hopefully motivate you to do so. But secondly, the uncanny, again, as mentioned during our seminars, it is awkwardly structured, starting with a lengthy and not altogether gripping discussion on the lexicographical oppositional pair heimlich, unheimlich, and culminating in a heavily manipulated and partial reading of a short story by E.T.A. Hoffman, The Sandman, which has been, of course, critically visited and revisited by virtually all major players in uncanny theory, including Ellen Sixu, Sarah Kaufman, and Mladen Dolar. And even more disappointingly, his insistence on the prevalence of the castration complex despite many suggestions of the complexity and ultimate undecidability of the uncanny, which are thrown in along the way. And as so often happens with Freud, sort of throwaway comments that are not elaborated are often far more interesting. Castle's approach to the essay as a thematic index is successful precisely because it follows this centrifugal lack of focus, entertaining the wildness that Freud attempted to suppress in his conclusion. Freud's essay has always been more interesting to parse and deconstruct than to summarize. But I would like to make one exception to this gloss in order to foreground the rather apologetic beginning to this essay. And yeah, just revisiting in this way the beginning of the essay, which is full of suggestions of trespass and weak defensiveness against anticipated criticisms highlighted here in yellow. Freud shows himself to be both out of his depth and out of bounds in dealing with the uncanny. His only excuse that it itself is a neglected area of aesthetics in need of urgent attention, he tells us, even from a non-expert such as himself. I am leaving the question open as to whether and to what degree such defensiveness is sincere or deployed as a rhetorical device, which is not unlikely, especially since this was certainly not the writer's first foray into art and literature. Indeed, depending on what edition of Freud you're using, there's a whole volume of his writings on art and literature. If Freud's uncanny merely evokes trespass, the figure of the willful space invader becomes a key agent of feminist uncanniness. And I'm here evoking Nirmal Puwar's figure of the space invader from her sociological book of 2004, Space Invaders, which examines the unsettling implications of women and global majorities entering fields where white male power is firmly entrenched. The unwelcome spoilsport is embodied in the dangerous father figures of Hoffman's short story, who, according to Mladen Dollar, exemplify Jacques Lacan's père jouissance, the omnipotent disruptor of joy, and more specifically, interrupter of coitus. For Sarah Ahmed, the queer feminist killjoy is explicitly linked with aggressively defamiliarizing world-making beyond and against social reproduction and the nuclear family. Being a killjoy can be a knowledge project, a world-making project, Ahmed writes, while the killjoy's defining willfulness is described as a form of creativity. I propose the killjoy as an exemplary agent of the feminist uncanny, whose presence taunts and whose memory haunts, to paraphrase Abigail Solomon Godot. Lorraine O'Grady's series of performances, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, between 1980 and 1983, namely Miss Black Middle Class, remains one of the artist's best-known works, centering around a persona that was generated out of O'Grady's anger at the racism and sexism then and still possibly prevalent in the art world, and her own complex relationship to Black womanhood, about which she has written extensively. The persona of Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, an aging and literally self-flagellating beauty queen who has not so much forgotten but deliberately dispensed with her manners, was also partly developed in response to Eleanor Antin's fictional persona of African-American ballerina Eleonora Antinova, as O'Grady explains in 2012. She says, "I liked the concept. It made me think of my mother, Lena, of what might have happened when she emigrated from Jamaica to Paris as an 18-year-old. But my mother was tall and willowy, the Black ballerina type, and neither this short, plump white woman in blackface, not her out-of-kilter vision of the Black character's experience could compute for me. That was the moment I decided I had to speak for myself." End of quote. Dressed in a gown and cape stitched together out of 180 pairs of white gloves, the symbols of oppression, as O'Grady explains, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire gave out white chrysanthemums while whipping herself with a white cat o' nine tails. She wore a tiara, a sash, identifying her as Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire of 1955, a title worn in Cayenne, French Guyana, thus casting black bourgeoisie as an international condition. 1955, the year of O'Grady's graduation from Wellesley, the elite women's college whose alumni, as you probably know better than I do, include Madeleine Albright and Diane Sawyer, conveys that 1980, when the persona first performed, was a jubilee year, a year in which she, quote, would enact a new consciousness. So this is the description displayed at one of the early performances. On the silver jubilee of her coronation in Cayenne, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire Internationale, who could still fit into her coronation gown and cape of 360 white gloves, celebrated by invading the New York art world. During her anniversary tournée, she attended several openings unannounced. While all eyes were on her, she smiled, distributed 4 dozen white chrysanthemums, and removed her cape. With a whip that made plantations move, she applied 100 lashes to her bare back, then shouted out an occasional poem. And this is her distributing flowers. She continues her tournée. Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire smiles, she smiles, she smiles, she says. Here she's removing her cape and gloves in preparation, self-flagellates, and recites her poetry, shouting poems against self-oppression as well as oppression, self-imposed cautiousness, and in favor of breaking literal and metaphorical boundaries. Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire was also an exorcism of O'Grady's own socialization and elite education, even while being partly enabled by the latter, by both, to be frank. So some of the occasional poems included those. I'm just going to read Wait with you. Wait in your alternate spaces, spit it on fish hooks of hope, be polite, wait to be discovered, be proud, be independent, tongues cauterized at openings no one attends, stay in your place. After all, our art is only for art's sake. That's enough. Don't you know, Sleeping Beauty needs more than a kiss to awake. Now is the time for an invasion. And here she is leaving and celebrating with her friends. Following the performances of 1980 and 81, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire became a curator of events and exhibitions, including the Black and White Show in 1983 at Kinkeliba, a Black New York gallery in which an equal number of white and Black artists were selected, and all exhibited work that had to be in black and white. Quote, to a blindingly obvious situation, sometimes you made an obvious reply, O'Grady comments. Yet, the ragingly inappropriate Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire performs an uncannily violent unmaking, remaking of identity that is both effective and complex. A revenant, crasher, and spoiler of celebrations, she draws attention to the emblems and material supports of identity formation and performance, white gloves, tiara, whip, awakens their disturbing historical baggage from enslavement to debutante balls and beauty pageants, and reconfigures them in an unsettling spectacle and a resonant voice that continues to haunt the history of contemporary art. Surprisingly, to me at least, O'Grady declares her performance a failure, which I don't believe to be coquettish self-deprecation. In a text written in 2007 on occasion of the exhibition WAC, Art and the Feminist Revolution, curated by Cornelia Butler, O'Grady contends that the art world, by which she meant a specifically, I think, bi-coastal urban US manifestation of it, would, quote, not become meaningfully integrated until the Adrian Piper and David Hammond's exhibits of 1988 to 89. Furthermore, the performances became victims of their own superficial recognizability, she claims, ever present and yet emptied out through the lazy reproduction of only one or two, three, or, two or three images from their documentation, capturing the self-flagellation and the poetic recitations, regularly name-checked, but barely understood. As a corrective to such tendencies, O'Grady put together a slideshow which I have more or less followed here today with a couple of my own additions using the artist's own materials. Whatever the measure of her success or lack thereof, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire has had an interesting afterlife. Quote again from O'Grady. Beyond her guerrilla invasions of art spaces, she was a state of mind. Even when not in costume and when using her own name, Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire events were surreptitiously indicated when O'Grady pinned white gloves to her clothing. O'Grady may fail, but does so spectacularly, like Freud did, and is forever shadowed by her dazzling, irreverent beauty queen of a double. Her uncanny space invader returns stealthily time and again, possessing the artist in uncomfortable compensation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful week, and it was great to hear more about your work. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.